Carolyn. Carolyn McDonald. It's time for us to start. Shit. All right. What I always like to do before we start our Odysseys is just give a very, very brief but important rundown. So, Marion, our presenter today, gets to speak uninterrupted for as long as he likes, as long as it doesn't go over about 45 minutes. But, but at any rate, after that, we'll have a short silence, take up the offering, and then there'll be time for questions. Remember that Marion is not required to answer any questions if he doesn't want to. And I will pass around the microphone for folks who have questions, so both the question and the answer gets on our recording. Okay, thanks again. And without further ado, this is Marion Huett Derosset.
Very good. Well, I rushed through writing this because I started it and fiddled around for a while. And then Beth called me as we were coming back from Michigan and said, "Can you do this week?" And so I said, "Maybe, let me look." So, this is my synopsis of what my life was like. Well, I was born in March of 1952, and it was the year of major flooding in the Midwest. My parents, Glenn and Frida Derosset, lived in the country most of their lives because my mom grew up on a farm outside of Langdon, Missouri, which is right off the railroad. And my dad actually was a hired hand at my grandfather's farm. So that's how they met. That's kind of interesting, I guess. He and his three brothers came up to Northwest Missouri because they were from Humansville, which is down by Bolivar. And it was pretty impoverished, so they came seeking their fortunes. Um, my parents were friends with a physician, Dr. Brown, in Nebraska City, and this is where I was born. Dr. Brown, uh, first, my mother had several abdominal surgeries and managed to survive all that. And he told her at age 38 that she was going to have another surgery. And at that point, she didn't dream she was pregnant, but that's what had happened. I was kind of a surprise late baby. Um, and the main problem with the flooding was they lived on the Missouri side of the river, and Dr. Brown was in Nebraska City on the other side. So to get to him, they had to travel all the way up to Omaha and come back down. And back in that day, there was no interstate, so it took them a little while. Um, he had a little 2-room hospital in his house because he was a DO, and back then they didn't allow DOs in the hospital. Later on, he took the tests and managed to get into the hospital. So we have visited the house since then. I did a little drive-by, and there's now dinosaurs on top of the house. So I don't know who bought that house. uh, yeah. Uh, my mother insisted that she wasn't going to raise a child out in the country, so they needed to move into Rockport. So neither of my parents had much education back then. You could get educated to the 8th grade, and after that, you had to pay for high school. So they both had 8th grade educations. But my father, he got a job at the lumber yard in town, and he taught himself carpentry. and he built the house we lived in. Um, I guess he probably couldn't lay all those concrete blocks by himself, but he had a little help. They lived in the basement at first, and then they built the upper part of the house. Um, I vaguely remember this, and it might be more of a one of these memories where you're told about it. But when I was around 5, I asked my mother where the cars were going past the house. Uh, we lived about 2 blocks away from the Church of Christ. And she said they were going to church. And so I said, well, why aren't we going to church? That was her in to start taking me to church. Uh, and originally we went to I do remember this church because I remember Bible school and church programs and all, but it was out in the country outside of Langdon, Missouri. And it was pretty primitive. There was a large uh, privy for the women and a little tiny one for the men. So there wasn't no plumbing there. So yeah. Um, Later, we started going to the Lutheran church in Rockport, and back then, of course, there's no air conditioning in the churches. Everybody sat around with their little fans that were provided with pictures of the Christian stuff on it. And I was baptized in the middle of the summer, and what I can remember about that is they had ice cold water for the baptism. That felt so good. It felt so good. Um, should have baptized everybody every week. Uh, so I was involved with the Lutheran Church then up through high school, and Luther League was the youth group, and we even few of us even came to a convention down here in Kansas City on the train. They Back then they put 4 of us high schoolers on the train and sent us to Kansas City with a warning that those taxi drivers they were going to try to steal our money, but we didn't have any problem with that. And I sang in choir because it was a small church, and so in high school I was in the choir, so I started my choir practice back then. Growing up in Rockport in the 50s and 60s was kind of like growing up in Mayberry. Uh, Population was about 1,800 then. Um, my younger summers were spent bicycling to the pool and roasting in the afternoon sun all afternoon. And some mornings when I was probably 11 to 15, something in that range, my mother would give me a list and send me biking down to the grocery store where I would buy the groceries and then bicycle back home. They would keep a store credit tab, and then my dad would go in every week and pay off the tab. So, kind of an interesting way I learned how to shop for groceries way back. My allowance back then was about 50 cents, and with 50 cents, you could go down and you could buy a comic for 10 to 12 cents and go to the movie theater for 35 cents. So, yeah, we'd go around and collect pop bottles that people would throw out, and we'd cash those in too and buy stuff with them. So it was an interesting time. It was nothing like it is anymore. Um, my class, and I went to the same school from grade 1 through 12, and my class was approximately 44 to 46 people. Uh, they divided us up into 2 groups, and unbeknownst to us, they submitted us to tests, and then they decided from the tests who probably was going to go on to higher education or who was not. And so I got put into the higher education class, but um, after during high school, I got a job as an assistant custodian at the school. So I learned a lot of janitorial type things, how to polish floors with a buffer. They always put you on the buffer and watch you try to wrestle that thing around till you finally realize if you lift up on the handle, it goes one way, and you push down, it goes the other direction. It's really easy once you know the trick. I was good in math and science and art, and my mother poo-pooed the art part and wanted me to focus on a trade. So, in probably middle of the high school, I'm trying to figure out what in the world I can go off and do. Um, Space program made me think of engineering, but there was also getting to be a glut in engineers at that time. A lot of them were getting laid off. So my cousin Gary, who was about 3 years older than me, went to Nebraska to start pharmacy school, and he was the closest to an older brother that I had. So I decided to try that. My parents couldn't afford an out of state uh, college and really couldn't afford to send me to an in-state college. But luckily, back then, the government was uh, helping out subsidizing student loans. So I was able to get loans and I think a grant and go to UMKC. I was afraid of going to Maryville first because back then your credits didn't transfer as easy as they do now. So I just came to Kansas City right off the bat. And that was the country mouse meeting the city mouse. Uh, Transition from a small rural town to Kansas City in 1970 was pretty dramatic. And I was all by myself. Nobody else came down here. Some went to St. Joseph, a lot of them went to Maryville, and some went to Columbia. But nope, they didn't come to Kansas City, so I got to meet a lot of new people. And some of them were jerks, and some of them were friends even today. So, and that's where I met Camila in my freshman year. By 1971, I also had my car here and was white knuckle driving in the big city. Um, okay, remembering that this was the 70s, I did do some drugs. Mainly, I smoked marijuana and did some LSD a few times. I found out closer to graduation that many of my pharmacy class did likewise. I had taken a summer job with the Rural Electric Cooperative on the ground crew, and the job with the ground crew was to keep the trees from growing up into the tree lines, or if they were already in the tree lines, uh, occasionally I'd be running a chainsaw and a chipper. But most of it was walking along the electric lines and spraying trees. And we sprayed the trees with a mixture of 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T mixed in diesel fuel. So we had this big old tank on the back of the truck, long hoses, and we'd be trotting along out there, wading through poison ivy and blackberries and all grass. So got a lot of exercise. Um, I had a brief job for all of 1 month painting grain bins. So that was, I specialized in painting the top because I didn't like standing on the ladder. So it's up there a couple stories. Um, we'd walk miles at a time, and then we'd take lunch. And during lunchtime, after we ate, we'd either nap Some of the time I napped underneath the truck, or some of the time we'd play horseshoes. It just depended on what we were doing. And I did this for 3 summers. When I came home to work on the third summer, I was down to 135 pounds. Can you imagine? I was half what I am. So by the end of the summer, with all the exercise and my mother fattening me up, I got up to about 155 pounds. So I was pretty fit back then. Graduated from pharmacy school in 1975. Definitely not at the top of my class. Um, but I made it through, and in November of 75, I started working at Kansas City General Hospital. That was quite the experience with the open wards, and it was just a maze getting around through that hospital trying to, because we had to go out there. We either sent runners out to get the orders, or we went out ourselves and got the orders. And so it was interesting. I remember the surgical ICU was pretty up high, and they had a balcony that the patients could be out on. And I think mostly the nurses took breaks out on the balcony. Um, so uh, a year later, we moved into Truman Medical Center, and that was kind of a mess because they weren't really ready for us to move in. They were still working on it when we moved in. In 1976, Camille and I were married at St. Francis Xavier Church up here on Cruise, the Holy Mackerel Church. If you look at it from up above, it's built like a fish. So we lived in an apartment in Grandview. Later in that year, her stepfather, who was in the building trade, by that point he had a hardware store in Blue Springs, hooked us up with a builder that had a house started but no buyer. So we started out with a poured foundation, and we got to pick everything else that went into the house. So that was a big learning experience that we used later when we built our second house. So we moved into that house in 77 in Raytown, and it's not really all that far from where Kendall and Mark now have a house. Very familiar with that neighborhood. Um, and down there, Alexis was born in 1973 and Andrew in 1986. So I was still working at Truman, and Camilla had taken a position in Linwood, Kansas, and it was taking her an hour and a half to commute each direction because if you get on 435, it was just a jam. And so we thought we needed to find some place that was a little more convenient. So I took a compass to a map and I drew circles on the map about what was 30-minute commute. And it turns out it was mainly up where we live now, up in the Parkville area. So we looked around for land up there. We eventually bought a plot of land, and then we looked for a builder. Um, so it was quite the building job because I knew better than to let them just go at it. I visited the work site once a day just to make sure they didn't screw something up, and they had. I got to correct a lot of things. At one point, we had expanded our kitchen area, and above it was a bedroom with a nice sized closet. Well, they decided they were just going to wall off part of the closet because they said, well, you didn't pay for that much square foot, did you, up there? And so I said, no, take that out. It would have made a nice little hidey hole if I would have figured out how to do that. Uh, the house was completed in July of '88, and my dad died that fall. He was 2 weeks short of 80 when he died. We hadn't been going to church, but we thought we probably needed to provide some sort of religious background for the kids. The Catholic Church didn't really excite me, so we started going to Gloria Dei Lutheran Church. And once again, I sang in the choir, and I also spent 6 years on the church council. Does that sound familiar? At In my time at Truman, I learned a lot by taking on different roles as I worked there. The first 5 years, I worked in the outpatient pharmacy. Later, I moved to inpatient. And at that point, there were 13 inpatient pharmacists, and we rotated through all the shifts, including the graveyard shift. I learned a great deal about medicine there and would sometimes go over because they would have a lunchtime lecture in the med school. And so some of the pharmacists, we'd go over and attend that just to see what was going on and learn a little more. I alpha tested the first inpatient computer system for the pharmacy, and later I was promoted to IV supervisor and ran the IV program. That was like the number 3 management position in the pharmacy. Um, Being promoted from within, you're not necessarily seen as a manager unless you do something. And my pharmacy assistant director was a bit on the lazy side, so it was real easy for me to convince him that I could do the reviews for the pharmacist. That kind of made them suddenly see me as a manager. I also would try my hand at different things. I was very interested in the metabolic support team. Uh, what they did was if you couldn't eat, you would either assess them to see if you could put a tube down and feed them in their gut, or if that wasn't going to work, then you put them on IV therapy. I found that to be very, very interesting, and I learned a lot because we had a team of the head of the Department of Surgery and some of his residents, plus a dietitian and a nurse, and then a pharmacist. So it was very, very interesting because we'd sit down and go over all our patients once a week. And I learned a lot there also that I later used in home care. Uh, in January of '96, I left Truman well, I'm skipping over some things. Let me back up here a little bit. I was also highly involved with oncology and with the neonatal ICU. Um, in July of '90, that doesn't make sense because somewhere around there, Camila's mother died, but it wasn't until, yeah, we moved in with my mother-in-law shortly before we built the house because our house sold. So we were living with her for about 3 months. And so at that point in time, we had both mothers still yet in our lives. Well, in July of '95, uh, she died. She had a inoperable abdominal aneurysm. She knew about this, and she had called my our daughter Alexis one afternoon and said her back was hurting and had me call. Well, I got home, forgot about it. We went to Sam's Club, I think. On the way home from Sam's Club, I suddenly went cling. Uh-oh. So I called, no answer. So I went down there by myself and I found her in the house. So um, in January of '96, I left Truman for a position with a struggling home care company called Signature. My infusion training came in very handy, but in home care, in pharmacy, hospitals, you send out the drug. The nurses worry about getting all the supplies from Central Supply. That's not the way it works in home care. In home care, the pharmacist has to supply all the supplies. You leave one thing out, it's like leaving out the nail for the horseshoe, that sort of thing. You can't get the job done. So I learned a lot about IV access and all the supplies and all the ways you have to do it. David back there smiling because he realizes that. Uh, so I had moonlighted at Children's Mercy for extra money while working at Truman. And about a year into the home care position, I was approached by the pharmacy director at Children's to be their outpatient pharmacy coordinator, which also was over their home care section. Like I said, it was a struggling home care company, so I jumped at the chance to get out of there and go over to Children's. So that in itself was a struggle. There was lots of things happening in home care, and, and not just home care, but in hospitals at that point. And that's when they put in the managed Medicaid, and we didn't have any way to bill for that stuff. And that was a primary reason, uh, revenue source. So I had to do this hand adjudication where you had these little boxes and we had to figure out each one of the ways of billing by just punching it into the box, writing all that down, and then training technicians to do that so that we could get paid for what we were doing. I didn't realize any of this when I took the job, and we were billing no insurance except for Medicaid. That's the only revenue source in the outpatient pharmacy. So it was very much under the gun, and we met practically every week with the head of the revenue, the fiscal people, to see how we were doing on that. I stayed there about a year. And then I heard an opening came open with my friend Jack Smith at Olston. So I called him up and he said, "Why don't you come out here and interview?" So I did. And I got that position and I stayed with that I say stayed with that company. It went through about six different buyouts during that time. So it was constantly coping with new management, somewhat new management. Most of the people stayed on. But I always said it was more like surfing, trying to stay on the board and just keep going and doing my job. Um, and I stayed with that company until finally in uh, June of 2020, I decided I was 68. I'm getting too old for this. I need to give this position over to somebody else. And so that's when I retired. Just coincided with when I would have renewed my license in Kansas. I decided I didn't need to do that anymore. My mother had macular degeneration to the point earlier, backtracking, she was declared legally blind and she had lived at home for as long as she could. And then she went into the nursing home for a brief time in Rockport. One day she was in went down the hallway, and if you're legally blind, it's kind of hard to count how many doors you're going to. And so she stopped one door short of her room, went in and started going through the dresser looking for maybe a sweater, I don't know. Well, they thought she was just getting demented or something, and so they put her on a antipsychotic to make her sit around more. And so Camila, bless her, said we could bring her home and stay with us. So we brought her down. Found out later the nursing home had a bet on how long we would keep her at home until we brought her back. But she lived with us until she died in our house there on hospice care. She had told us at Thanksgiving that she wasn't going to be around much longer, so if we had any questions, go ahead and ask her. Didn't have very many questions, but she died about 2, 3 weeks later, just long enough that hospice was probably very good. She got to pick out the music for her funeral and stuff like that. She was 1 month short of 95, so I have fairly, if I take care of myself and don't fall down and try to kill myself or something, I might live a little while. We had stopped going to the Lutheran church as they weren't really quite liberal enough for us. And so after my mother died, I said, if you want to go to church, Camila, this is one church I think we can try out. So we visited All Souls. I'd heard about it from KKFI. And in 2008, we joined. Um, Shortly after joining, I was nominated for the board. I remember Ginger coming to me going, "Oh, they only meet once a month." And I laughed in her face because having been on church council before, I knew exactly what I was getting into. But I spent 3 years on the board that time, and that was during the time of troubles. I don't know what we call it these days, but finally in my last year, Kendall was with us, and so it was a good time. And I got off at that point. Jumping forward, 2015 was a big year. Camila was diagnosed with breast cancer and went through surgery, radiation, and chemo. In May, after visiting California, I came back and I fell at our property and I ruptured my spleen, which nearly took me out. Uh, Actually, I coded twice on the operating table, so I'm close to death. 2020 was the plague year. I turned 68 and it was good to retire. And so in October, Camila and I got COVID, which was a scary couple of weeks. And in December, Alexis married Tony Lupo, and the following February, our grandson Philip was born. That was an interesting wedding. We drove all the way up to Michigan because we didn't want to fly in a plane during the time of COVID. And they had a small wedding. I think they were restricted to having maybe 20 guests there. So Andrew ran the video for it. And so some people zoomed in on it. So so Philip was born in February. Alexis was born in February. So there's a couple of Aquarians right there. In 2021, I was nominated for the board again, and I served 2 years before stepping away from that. In 2023, our granddaughter Isabella was born on Valentine's Day. Isabella was Camilla's mother's name. You probably heard this. She tells this story a lot, but we're going to repeat it. It was a bit traumatic because on the 13th of February in Lansing, Michigan, they had the gunman shoot up MSU. And so the hospital she went to give birth was where they were taking all the gunshot victims. So the anesthesiologists were a bit uh, occupied, and when they placed her epidural, they did it badly. So she had a luckily, the birth happened quickly, but she had a few painful minutes there. Uh, so Andrew went up to visit them, and shortly after he came back from there, um, I went down the basement and found his body. So, thanks to our family and friends and the sport we managed to, and with all this, we managed to weather the storm. And I want to thank everybody for your help in this difficult time. We're spending more time in Michigan now with our daughter, son-in-law, and grandkids. And so if you don't see us here for weeks on end, it's not like we've moved totally. We're talking about maybe getting someplace up there, but at this point in time, we haven't came up with whether to rent or buy or I'm kind of happy with where we're at right now in house. As we were pulling out to come here this morning, Camila looked over and said, "Oh, isn't that cute?" There was a fawn laying in our front yard near a tree, and so we like the wildlife up there. Some of the things we don't like is after we came back, I think a mouse got into our car because I had some sort of food item in there, and we had fragments of food on the floor, so they can get into the smallest little cracks. But and the raccoons have occasionally invaded our home, but other than that, we like it out there. So I think I'm about 35 minutes in, so I think that's a good point to stop this and take up the let's see, George. Oh, there he
He's here.
is.
Okay.
Take
Well,
up this.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Marion. I appreciate you. So let's just take a minute and take some deep breaths. Okay, and as George passes the collection, I'm going to um, come around. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll bring you the microphone.
You would.
First off, thank you. Um, so you attended mostly the Lutheran Church overall, but they were not liberal enough for you. So I guess my question at this point is, what is your belief set? What do you ascribe to religiously?
I'm not sure if I believe in God or not, so I'm kind of an agnostic on that. Um, I believe people should be, I'm more of a humanist. I believe people should be treated properly. One thing that they were struggling with at the Lutheran Church was accepting gay people. They just couldn't get their arms wrapped around it. And I was almost positive that our assistant minister who lived with another retired minister were gay, and they didn't quite get it, I guess. Um, so I'm just very much a progressive liberal on that, and I don't know if that answers your question or not. I pretty much like the 7 or 8 principles we have. I believe in taking care of the earth and taking care of people.
Hi, Marion. I know you've served on the board at least twice. What do you
Mhm.
have to say to this audience that would encourage them to serve on the board? What were the positive things you experienced? Encourage them.
I do miss knowing what's going on to that extent, but you have to want to look behind the curtain to see what's going on because some people don't want to do that. They just rather come in and do their thing on Sunday and then go away. But there's a lot of decisions that have to be made more than monthly. So if you haven't done it, I'd encourage you to try it. I mean, it is once or twice a month, plus a few other things thrown in, plus about every Sunday. So it's it is a commitment.
Hi, Marion.
Hi, Brian.
How are you? Thank
Good.
you for sharing your story. I just wanted to tell you and the person that just spoke that the board is well represented here today. So, yeah, I enjoyed learning more about you and again, excited. The choir starts on Monday.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna go to that choir practice, though I won't be here for the September um, present
You won't
presentation.
be here for the cantata?
I thought there was one in September too. Oh, I will be here for the October one, but I'm gonna miss a few practices because once again, Tony and Alexis have a weekend that they're both gonna be out doing 2 different things, and we're going to have the kids all to ourselves. So that'll be interesting. Sometimes that's easier when she's not around because, as Tony got to learn this last time, she did a little excursion to see her uh, sorority sisters in Chicago, and all of a sudden went from Mama do it to Daddy do it. So I guess this time it'll be Opa and Oma doing it. And even as we were leaving this time, Isabella finally said Opa to me. And then when we were on the FaceTime just this week, she said Oma. So she's getting the verbal down. It's not quite so frustrating for her, and it's not just the point at things and try to get you to guess what she wants.
Hi, Marion. Thank you
Hi.
for your comments. Uh, I'm curious. You went to the Lutheran Church for a long time. How did you manage to migrate from the Lutheran Church? I attended Lutheran churches for many years, and migrate from there to Unitarian Universalist.
You know, I never totally bought into the Lutheran Church's story and the biblical stories constantly that we were going through in a cycle every year. And it never sank in totally with me. I tried this saved by grace and all that stuff, and it just didn't seem like I was being honest with myself and honest with other people. So I guess that's the way. And then ELCA, yes. Oh yes, the Missouri. We even had a few that had migrated over from Missouri Synod, and they didn't like when women had anything to do with the service. So they could they could put out the little wine in the little cups, and they could do that. But yeah, yeah, work in the kitchen.
Could you talk about your volunteer in the choir and is that a spiritual exercise for you or just what it means to you?
I've always liked singing, uh, and I can't think of her name right now. But I was in listening to the choir one time, and I was sitting beside a person from the choir that wasn't in choir that time, and said, "Oh, you should join the choir." I said, "Oh, I'm not really as good as they are." At that point, I didn't know we had the section leaders, and she said, "Oh no, you should go and try it." So next Sunday or next Monday, I went and tried out, and I really liked it. I'm not all that great, but I'm learning with time, and I can kind of read music. Nothing like some of the choir members that really studied well. I know what this note on the bass clef means to me. So I know if it's up there, I'm probably not going to get there. But yeah, I like it.
Just so those, so you know, Camilla's phone is being circulated with a very cute picture of two very gorgeous grandchildren.
Yeah.
One time I was talking to Camilla, and it must have been near Halloween, and she described some things that you had built for Halloween. Tell me about your Halloween thing.
Oh, yes. We was a guy in our neighborhood, Jerry. He liked to do Halloween up big, so I said, "Well, I think I can do some of this." So one year, I was just dinking around, and I built a guillotine with with a, a dummy body up here. I went out and got some camouflage netting. I put a cardboard like bucket around my head, and I laid out there on the ground, and it was right by the sidewalk, so they had to walk past me. And so as they came past, I would just say, "Hey, hey, hey, can you scratch my nose? I can't quite reach it." I scared to come up. You have a long driveway. People drive. They would drive up like the adults would drive. This particular one was a couple of women in a van with their kids, and they were taking the kids around to the front door, and I scared the adults more than I did the kids. Another time, I disassembled some of that stuff. I had a coffin out there, and when I put the coffin by the front door with the candy down near it, and we had a guinea pig at that point, so I had the guinea pig in the coffin, so it was like a rat in the coffin. Another time, I took all that in stuff, and I made a small pirate ship, and I sat on the pirate ship and had a little treasure chest down here that they could reach into and get their treats out of. a lot of work.
My questions doesn't have any real fun to it, or maybe it does. I don't know. So you talked about your discomfort with the Lutherans and how you were kind of ready to find something else. But what about KKFI? How did that help connect you here?
We used to advertise on KKFI. It was, yeah, as much as they have ads, yeah. This is supported by All Souls. And so I heard about it.
Describe us
Enough, enough. And I don't know if we do that anymore.
I don't think we do, but it used to be that the forum would be broadcast on
Yeah,
KKFI, not on a live basis, but I
no,
think later, I don't recall the time of that, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I picked up on the forum, but trying to find the forum, I didn't know exactly when it was being broadcast. So it was just willy nilly, if I managed to catch it.
So it sounds like you have a number of very practical skills in terms of your early work history, and then of course your Halloween construction. But what do you love to do other than play with your grandkids and sing in the choir?
Uh, I'm pretty much down to reading more now. Um, I too have macular degeneration, which I got from my mother, and so I'm getting injections of Avastin, and luckily it's arrested everything, and I only have to get those injections every 4.5 months. So it's got it under control, but my eyesight is not as great, and that was another reason I decided to retire. Is we lot tracked our drugs in home care so that if there was a recall, we could track it back to the patient, and depending on the level of the recall, it was getting very difficult to see some of those things, especially when some of the manufacturers would use this indented type thing where they would just indent the print on the package, and you had to kind of hold it to the side to see what the numbers were. And so I'm a little bit limited on my eyesight from that. I don't draw as much as I probably should. Even Monet and Van Gogh, don't know as they could see that well. So, so Alexis got out the notepad when we were up there and some colored pencils and wanted me to draw their house. Well, I drew it in just regular pencil, and that's about all I did on that one. I told her I took a picture of it. I could even do that back here, but so far I haven't.
Um, one of the things I find about these Odysseys is that the parallels and common ground that people have with my life too. And it turns out you and I were at UMKC at the exact same time, and that a lot of us were doing construction and heavy duty work seemed to be common to a lot of the folks. And then we also were convinced, I guess is a term, by Ginger Powers to do things that we so I just wanted to make
Well,
did the hard work that you experienced at UMKC really have a lot to do with your skill sets today?
oh, I don't know. I don't know. Part of my building things probably stem from my dad being a carpenter, and we had scrap wood around the house, and hammers with one broken claw off of it there to mess with, or saws or stuff like this. So from early on, I played around with tools and watched my dad saw part of his thumb off, making me a toy once. That was the amazing part. He clipped the edge of his thumb and made it kind of pointy. And I don't know if we had some sort of weird biology, but he grew that thumb back. It wasn't pointy forever. After a couple of years, you wouldn't have known he did it.
Well, I knew a guy named Steve Herman from Nebraska. Did you know him at UMKC? He was a hardworking farm boy.
No, no. But I met one of my longtime good friend, Paul Smith, there. And so he was a roommate for 1 year, and then that was 71, 72. Then he decided he was going to go to Columbia because he wanted to do agriculture, and so he went to do that. But when he and Marianne got married at the beginning of October, and 2 weeks later, we got married, and so we were in each other's weddings. And as recently as last September, we took a train vacation to California, arriving right when the hurricane was.
Nice.
So I got to see that river full to the bank there. When we got there, we were about 5 or 6 hours late getting in there because they had the passenger train pull over while they were getting all the freight trains moved east away from the coast. So it was interesting. Wet Los Angeles. It was beginning of September of 2023, or tail end of August. I don't remember which.
Well, if there are any other questions, please put up your hand. But if not, I have a comment and a question. You mentioned that your mother had these abdominal surgeries, and then you showed up as a bit of a surprise when she was 38. I was 38 when my mom had me, but I was her fifth child. She was 40 when she had my younger brother. So, anyway, do you have any siblings?
No, only child. Camila is an only child. She has a step sister, and that's a whole different story. She could do her own Odyssey on that. But yeah, we did find that she has a half sister in Poland. So, but we haven't really communicated with her much. We did one uh, Zoom, not Zoom. What was the one before? Skype. We did a Skype with her. He does not speak English. Uh, both sons do. They were both in IT, and so it was kind of interesting. Parallels look a lot alike.
Well, once again, I would love to thank Marion and invite you all to come back next week. We have a very long time member presenting, Karen Wells.